In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, Europe stood in a state of exhaustion, unlike anything it had ever experienced. Entire empires had died in a matter of months. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian imperial structures, centuries-old pillars of the continent, collapsed under the combined weight of military defeat, revolution, famine, and financial ruin. Cities that once served as cultural capitals were now burdened with unemployment, homelessness, and factories standing silent. Millions of soldiers returned home to towns that no longer resembled the places they had left behind. It was a moment that felt simultaneously like an ending and the uncertain beginning of something far more fragile. The armistice of November 1918 did not bring peace in the emotional sense. It brought only a pause, a breath, a chance for societies to grasp how much they had lost. More than 9 million soldiers were dead, millions more wounded or permanently disabled, and countless civilians had perished from hunger and disease. The war had introduced industrial killing on a scale that stunned even the generals who ordered it. And yet, despite this devastation, the months that followed did not deliver the unity or stability so many hoped for. Instead, Europe entered a turbulent transition, marked by revolutions, counter-revolutions, and political uncertainty that threatened to undermine the very peace the armistice was supposed to guarantee. Across Germany, Austria, and Hungary, returning soldiers found striking workers, occupying factories, and revolutionary councils attempting to seize power. The collapse of imperial authority created a vacuum into which new political forces rushed with remarkable speed. In Berlin, the government struggled to impose order as armed militias. Veterans groups and radical paramilitaries clashed in the streets. In Munich, a short-lived Soviet-style republic emerged. Within Russia, civil war raged as the Bolsheviks fought to consolidate their revolution. Even victorious states were not immune to unrest. In Italy, striking workers and disillusioned veterans expressed their frustration through increasingly radical politics, laying the groundwork for movements that would shape the decades ahead. Economically, the continent faced a situation few policymakers were prepared to handle. Wartime borrowing had drained national treasuries, and governments resorted to printing money simply to keep basic functions running. Agricultural production had collapsed in some regions. Rail networks were damaged, and trade routes disrupted. Families had spent their savings during the war, leaving them vulnerable as inflation eroded the value of whatever remained. The sense of instability was amplified by the knowledge that millions of demobilized soldiers needed work at a time when the economy could barely support the civilian population. Diplomatically, the armistice created a confusing gray zone. Germany still retained a functioning government and army, yet it no longer possessed the authority or legitimacy it once claimed. Allied leaders, meanwhile, feared that pushing Germany too hard risked driving it into civil war or a radical revolution. Yet many in France and Britain believed that anything less than severe punishment would betray the immense sacrifice of their soldiers. The tensions between these competing ideas shaped the atmosphere leading to the peace negotiations in Paris, where the future of Europe would be debated with extraordinary intensity. The people living through this period sensed that the old world had vanished, but the new world had not yet arrived. The war had shattered illusions about progress, stability, and rational diplomacy. The continent's political map had been redrawn, its economies destabilized, and its societies traumatized. Beneath the surface, anger, fear, and disillusionment simmered. In Germany, nationalist grievances grew louder as rumors spread that the nation had not been defeated in battle, but betrayed by politicians at home. In Eastern Europe, competing national movements clashed over borders that had been hastily drawn and poorly understood. Throughout the continent, the idea that peace had truly been secured felt increasingly fragile. The early post-war years were defined by a desperate search for direction. Some placed their hopes in democracy, believing that political participation could heal wartime wounds and prevent future conflict. Others embraced radical ideologies that promised swift solutions to economic hardship and national humiliation. Political moderation struggled to survive in an environment where frustration and uncertainty outweighed patience and compromise. This fragile moment, suspended between war and peace, became the foundation on which the rest of the 20th century would be built. The decisions, failures, and tensions of these early years shaped the political climate that followed. Many feared that the peace would not last. Many quietly believed that another, even more devastating conflict was possible. And as events unfolded across Europe, it became increasingly clear that the end of the First World War had not settled the continent's deep-rooted problems, it had merely exposed them. The fragile calm that settled over Europe in late 1918 was not a peace born of resolution, but a silence shaped by exhaustion. Beneath that silence, every major society on the continent faced pressures that were far more complex than most leaders understood at the time. Cities that had once represented the height of European civilization, Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, were now places where competing visions for the future collided in the open streets. The war had not only broken armies, it had broken assumptions about how nations were supposed to function. The immediate aftermath of the armistice created a psychological shock that historians often describe as a collective disorientation. Millions of people struggled to understand how a war that had begun with patriotic enthusiasm could end with entire societies on the brink of collapse. This confusion allowed extremist groups in multiple countries to spread their own interpretations of what had happened. In Germany, nationalists blamed civilian leaders for accepting the armistice. In Russia, Bolshevik leaders used the chaos to argue that capitalism had failed. In parts of Eastern Europe, nationalist movements claimed that the war had proven the impossibility of multi-ethnic empires. Every group, regardless of ideology, pointed to the war as proof that old systems could no longer endure. The physical destruction of the war magnified this psychological crisis. Entire regions of France and Belgium were unrecognizable villages erased, forests reduced to splinters, railway lines twisted like metal ribbons. In Central Europe, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire produced immediate shortages of food, coal, and medical supplies. The empire's internal borders, once administrative lines, now became hard frontiers that trapped goods on one side and populations on the other. An area that for centuries had depended on economic interdependence suddenly found itself paralyzed by nationalist fragmentation. In Germany, the government faced an unprecedented series of challenges. Political authority could not rely on the prestige of victory. It could only attempt to navigate a revolutionary landscape. Workers' councils inspired by events in Russia formed in industrial cities. Soldiers returned home and joined paramilitary groups, deeply resentful of the political instability they encountered. Business leaders feared radical uprisings, while conservative elites hoped to restore a pre-war order that no longer existed. Each of these groups imagined a different future, and none were prepared to compromise. Further complicating matters was the ongoing influenza pandemic, which swept across Europe and killed tens of thousands in the months after the armistice. Hospitals were overwhelmed, doctors and nurses were exhausted, and communities already weakened by wartime malnutrition found themselves struggling to survive a new and deadly crisis. For many civilians, the pandemic made the distinction between war and peace almost meaningless. Suffering continued with barely a pause. At the same time, Europe's political map was shifting with remarkable speed. Poland re-emerged after more than a century of partition, but immediately found itself in conflicts with Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet state. The Baltic regions fell into war as independence movements sought to establish control before larger powers intervened. In the Balkans, old rivalries resurfaced under new flags. Every region confronted the same question: where should borders be drawn, and who had the authority to decide? The end of the war had answered none of these issues. Amid this uncertainty, the peace negotiations in Paris began to take shape. The delegates who gathered there arrived with competing expectations. France sought security and retribution after suffering enormous losses and devastation. Britain wanted stability, but feared that a weakened Germany would invite future conflict or revolution. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, promoted the idea of a fair and lasting peace based on national self-determination. Yet these principles collided with the realities on the ground. Creating new borders that satisfied every group proved impossible. Each decision produced winners and losers, and for the losers, resentment took root early. Back in Germany, rumors spread rapidly about what the eventual peace terms might include. Newspapers speculated wildly. Military leaders, unwilling to admit their own strategic failures, encouraged the belief that the army had remained undefeated in the field and had been undermined by civilians. This narrative, though false, became a powerful emotional weapon. It offered a simple explanation for a complex defeat and provided fertile ground for political extremism. It also weakened the legitimacy of the new democratic government at the very moment it needed public trust. Meanwhile, throughout Europe, ordinary people struggled simply to live. Food shortages forced families to wait in long lines for bread and potatoes. Coal shortages meant bitterly cold winters, especially in Central Europe. Inflation ate away at savings. Veterans faced unemployment and often suffered from physical or psychological trauma that societies were ill-equipped to treat. Entire communities felt abandoned by states that promised stability, but delivered only uncertainty. What made this period so precarious was not just the scale of the destruction, it was the fact that no one truly knew what direction the continent was heading. Democracy appeared fragile, but so did authoritarian alternatives. Some believed that international cooperation might prevent future conflict, while others were convinced that national strength was the only safeguard in a dangerous world. European leaders were attempting to build new political systems at a moment when faith in institutions was at its weakest. This fragile peace was filled with hope, fear, ambition, and resentment all at once. It held the potential for reconstruction and reconciliation, but also the seeds of future conflict. People sensed that history had reached a crossroads. They felt that the decisions being made and the failures being ignored would shape the fate of the continent for generations. And they were right. The peace that followed the First World War was fragile, not because Europe lacked opportunities to rebuild, but because its political, social, and economic foundations were deeply fractured. What emerged from these fractures would determine the course of the next 3 decades, and ultimately lead the world into a conflict even more devastating than the one that had just ended. In early 1919, Paris became the center of global diplomacy. The city, still marked by the strains of war, filled with delegates, advisors, journalists, and observers from around the world. Hotels overflowed, cafes buzzed with rumors, and countless meetings took place behind closed doors as nations attempted to reshape the world order. Although dozens of countries sent representatives, power ultimately rested with a small handful of leaders who defined the direction and tone of the peace settlement. Woodrow Wilson arrived as something of a global celebrity. Across Europe, crowds greeted him with enthusiasm, seeing him as a symbol of hope, democracy, and a new international system. His 14 points had raised expectations among ethnic minorities, colonial populations, and small nations who believed that the principles of self-determination would allow them to escape imperial control or assert national independence. His presence brought moral authority, but moral authority alone would not determine the final treaty. Standing opposite Wilson was Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, who had lived through the Franco-Prussian War, the humiliation of 1871, and the devastation of 1914 to 1918. For Clemenceau, French security was non-negotiable. He believed Germany should be weakened permanently, stripped of its ability to launch another offensive, and forced to pay for the destruction of northern France. His determination often clashed with Wilson's idealism, and their negotiations were filled with heavy tension. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, positioned himself between Wilson and Clemenceau. British voters demanded reparation payments and accountability, but British strategic interests required a stable, functioning Germany to maintain economic balance in Europe. Lloyd George understood that if Germany collapsed entirely, Bolshevism might spread westward, creating new dangers. His role became that of a mediator, attempting to temper Clemenceau's demands without alienating Wilson. Italy, represented by Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, sought territorial gains along the Adriatic and in the former Austro-Hungarian lands. Italian nationalists believed they had been promised rewards for joining the war on the Allied side, but the other leaders viewed many of Italy's claims as unreasonable. Orlando's frustration grew throughout the negotiations, and at one point, the Italian delegation left Paris altogether. Their departure did little to change the direction of the treaty, but it deepened Italy's sense of betrayal, an emotion that would later fuel political extremism. The German delegation arrived much later, and not by choice. They were excluded from the negotiations and were invited only to receive the final terms. When they entered the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, they encountered a document far more severe than expected. Germany protested that the treaty was incompatible with Wilson's 14 points, which they had believed would form the basis of peace. Though Allies dismissed their objections. The treaty removed large territories from Germany. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Polish territory was restored, and a Polish corridor cut through former German lands to give the new Polish state access to the sea. Much of Germany's overseas empire was dismantled and redistributed as mandates under the supervision of the League of Nations. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were handed to Britain, France, Japan, and others. Military restrictions were even more severe. The German army was reduced to 100,000 troops. The navy was limited to a handful of ships. Submarines were banned entirely. The air force was abolished. The Rhineland, bordering France, was to be demilitarized, and Allied forces would occupy parts of it for years. From the French perspective, these restrictions were essential safeguards. From the German perspective, they were humiliating and dangerous. The clause that struck the deepest nerve in Germany was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. It stated that Germany accepted responsibility for causing the war, although it was largely a legal mechanism created to justify reparations. It was interpreted by many Germans as a moral accusation. Historians today recognize that the causes of the war were complex and involved multiple nations. But in 1919, Article 231 became a symbol of national humiliation. German politicians, including moderates, condemned it fiercely. Reparations payments were another source of conflict. The exact amount was not decided in Paris, but was left to a future commission. Still, Germans understood that the bill would be enormous. France wanted reparations to help rebuild destroyed regions. Britain wanted Germany to bear the cost of pensions for soldiers and war widows. Wilson, though reluctant, accepted reparations as part of the political compromise needed to secure support for the League of Nations. Germany feared the payments would cripple its economy, and eventually they did. Even as Germany objected, the treaty moved forward. But Germany was not the only nation affected. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to a complete reshaping of Central Europe. New states emerged, often with borders drawn quickly and imperfectly. Czechoslovakia included large German-speaking populations in the Sudetenland. Yugoslavia united multiple ethnic groups with conflicting interests. Poland returned to the map after more than a century, but inherited long-standing regional tensions. The designers of the new Europe attempted to balance ethnic claims with strategic needs, but many created more problems than they solved. The Ottoman Empire, too, was dismantled, although its final fate would be decided later through additional treaties. In the Middle East, former Ottoman territories were divided into mandates under British and French authority. Borders were drawn with little consideration for existing communities, laying the groundwork for future conflicts. As negotiations progressed, the League of Nations became the centerpiece of Wilson's vision. He believed that an international organization capable of mediating disputes would prevent future wars. Many nations welcomed the idea, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty. Political opposition in Washington argued that the League would compromise American sovereignty. Without the participation of the United States, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions, and its credibility suffered from the beginning. Throughout 1919, as the treaty was finalized, public opinion shifted. In Allied countries, the war had left deep scars, and many believed that Germany deserved harsh punishment. But economists and some political leaders warned that the treaty was unsustainable. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who had observed the negotiations firsthand, resigned in protest and published a book arguing that the reparations would destabilize Europe for decades. His warnings proved prophetic. In Germany, the Treaty S signing created a sense of betrayal. Many Germans believed that their military had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been undermined by political collapse at home. This belief, later shaped into the stab-in-the-back myth, claimed that the German army was betrayed by civilians, socialists, and minorities. Although entirely false, the myth gained enormous political power and was used by radical groups to discredit democracy. The treaty, intended to build a stable peace, instead created widespread resentment. Germany accepted it only under threat of force. Italy felt cheated. Eastern Europe became a patchwork of overlapping claims. The League of Nations lacked enforcement power. And while France achieved military security on paper, the underlying political tensions in Europe remained unresolved. The Treaty of Versailles became a symbol of both ambition and failure. Its creators sought to prevent another global conflict, yet its compromises and contradictions made the international system fragile. What emerged from Paris in 1919 was not a firm foundation for peace, but an unstable structure that would be shaken repeatedly by economic crisis, nationalist movements, and political extremism. The world hoped Versailles would end war. Instead, the treaty planted seeds of anger and instability that would eventually grow into the greatest conflict in human history.